important thing. He has been asking me for a few years to come and speak to y'all. I've been asked to speak because I have recently been in your shoes not that long ago. I'm a physician, I'm a Christian, but beyond that, despite Scott saying I might have a lot of great tidbits to share with you, I feel like I've really struggled quite a bit with this whole thing of being a Christian and being in medicine. And so I come to you and I plan to share with you some of my struggles. I plan to share with you some of the things that have helped me and that I continue to struggle with and that I think through and pray through. So I hope that this will be an encouragement to you. So first I want to thank you all for having me. Second, I want to commend you for being here. One of my points at the last of the slide, if we don't even get there, I want to go ahead and jump to it. Being a part of an organic religious community is vitally important to you. And I just want to say this is a military thing. Bottom line up front, it is vitally important that you're here, eating free food. I know, like, anytime there's free food, I would show up and get it in college and medical school, etc. But it's vitally important for you to be involved in an organic religious community here with fellow dental students, fellow medical students. I'm not sure we have nursing students as well. I can't emphasize that to you enough. It was a few years ago I was actually invited to go to a CMDA special event, like a Thursday night at a country club. I can't remember, I couldn't tell you the speaker's name. But I went up to him afterwards and I had felt completely rejuvenated by his talk. I think it was my third year of residency, and I think I'd been to church maybe 6 times the entire year. And I was dying of thirst for Scripture. And when he spoke, I went up to him afterwards and I just kind of told him, this is where I am. I've been to church like 6 times. I grew up loving church. I was in seminary and was in that community where church life is everything. And then you're placed in medical school and then residency, and you're kind of pulled out of that, maybe if you grew up with that. And his advice to me at that point was, residency, he was a physician, he said, residency is the black hole of your soul. Do whatever you can to survive. And so I feel like I have survived. I don't know that I did a great job, but I hopefully can share with you some of the things that I've learned, 2 years and all my experience on the other side of residency. I will say there is light at the end of the tunnel. I will say that God created Sabbaths for a reason, and he gave the Israelites different types of Sabbaths. Some people got to rest once a week. And, he also gave a year of Jubilee every 49 years for the crops to rest, for the land to rest. Some of us are in seasons where we don't feel like we get to rest. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. You will have, hopefully, a period in your life when you're not quite as busy as you are right now. So a few things I want to talk about. One is identity. 2 is purpose, and 3 is how do we do this. These are big questions like Kierkegaard and Kant and St. Paul and your pastors talk about. I don't really have anything to add beyond confessing to you that I struggle with this. I know who I am. I'm a son of God. I'm an heir with Christ, and yet I listen to what the culture says that I should be. I think we all struggle with that. We all struggle with who am I? What am I supposed to do? Am I being called to go on this mission trip, or am I being called to go into general dentistry? I talked to Will earlier. He's putting on general dentistry. Sorry, Will. Now he's embarrassed. I've struggled with what is my call and how am I going to be serving God best? And sometimes the answer isn't clear. I want to talk a little bit about calling to maybe help delineate what that looks like for you. Maybe not specifically. I don't have like a crystal ball to say who you should marry or what practice you should join or what residency you should choose. But I do think that Scripture is clear and there's some good guidance there. And then third, like, how do we go about Christianity? How do we go about being a Christian in the medical profession? And when I was first asked to give this talk, I looked at some talks that some other folks had given to medical students, to other students, and I'm going to share with you briefly from a couple of stalwarts of history in medicine, and then also some more current voices as well. So, our identity. I think we can all agree that our culture isn't one that's preaching, you are a child of God, you are created in the image of Christ, therefore go and do good things. It's one that's saying, you need to seek power, you need to seek beauty, you need to find fulfillment in your job, how much money you make, how beautiful you are. If you are a member of the Honor Society, I mean, we're all kind of nerdy, so maybe we don't think about power and prestige and being a politician or whatever you think is powerful, but we do think about, well, what about, I mean, I need to make the top 5%, I need to be an AOA, or I need to graduate, or maybe you're just like, I need to make a C. I have to graduate dental school, I have to graduate medical school. And maybe you don't have to. I mean, I think for some of us, some piece of advice that was given to me was like, if you can't, you have a wife and children, this is when I was in medical school, if you can't pass medical school, or if you can't get all A's in medical school without first attending to your calling to your wife to be a husband, and calling to your children to be a father, and a calling to go to church, like if you can't not make A's, then maybe God doesn't want you to make A's. And that was refreshing and helpful to me, because I, since I was a kid, you know, like your parents say, you can do whatever you want to if you study hard enough, if you do well in school, if you get good grades. What do you want to be when you grow up? And one of my kids said the other day, and Daddy, I want to be a ice cream salesman that drives around in a little van. And that was kind of a recurring theme, so I kind of laughed the first few times. And I said, no, you don't want to do that. You probably want to do something else. But I found myself coaching my, I don't know how old he was at the time, my 6-year-old into what's proper and what's expected and what's a good career. So I found myself, this is my struggle, that I'm not the professional. Doing the same thing to my children that was done to me. I think, honestly, I saw my grandfather as a physician and thought, I want to be just like Granddaddy. Like, I want to wear bow ties all the time, and I want to never be without a blue blazer and a bow tie. And that's kind of how I got started in thinking I wanted to be in medicine. And that came to an abrupt stop for me when I was in college. I got involved in college ministry and was doing the whole pre-med thing. I was kind of doing my own thing too, studying medieval studies on the side. And some folks recommended that I consider going into ministry. And so I did an internship in college, kind of taking the MCAT, did that, got that out of the way, and then got married, and then did like a 180 turn and decided to go down to seminary and do an internship at a church, which I loved. And I felt God was calling me to that. But even in that decision, I felt like I was struggling with identity, trying to say, I want to be this person, and that's going to make me happy. I need to find fulfillment in, if it's not being a physician, then it's going to be in being a preacher. And I really was doing seminary for my own reasons, and not because I was seeking to serve others. And so that was something that I had to, halfway through seminary, stop and say, this isn't what I want to do. This isn't what God has called me to be, gifted me specially to do. And so my wife was and is amazing, and we prayed about it, and then she did like another 180-degree turn, and we moved back to Tennessee so I could be in-state residency. Thankfully, it was the last year that my MCAT applied, so I got to use that. I didn't have to take that beast again, and applied to medical school, and went to medical school. And that was, God knew what he was doing. I didn't. I still don't really know what I'm doing, but God does. And I just want to encourage you that you are going to be continually challenged to find your identity in medicine, in dentistry, in nursing, whatever it is, whatever your job is. That's what our culture does. We go up to somebody at a cocktail party and we say, hey, I'm Jonathan. Hey, I'm Mark. What do you do, Mark? And that's how we identify people, with what they do. And, you know, in an ancient Eastern culture it would be like, maybe where are you from, or who is your family? We don't do that in America. We identify ourselves with what we do, and that's okay. I mean, most of our time is spent doing what we spend 15 years training to do. So I'm not saying you can't identify yourself as a dentist, as a physician. That might be what God has called you uniquely to do. But it is a challenge not to get caught up in finding fulfillment in your complete identity in your profession. And I would say, I'll speak as a physician, but it's applicable to dentists, it's applicable to investment bankers, to young lawyers, to young professionals of any stripe. We face this challenge and this struggle because that's what the culture is telling us. You are what you do, you are what you produce. In an academic environment, your curriculum vitae becomes your living life. I mean, it's the life of your curriculum, what you've done, what you've produced. It can be a stifling thing in the academic setting. It can be an idol for some academicians. And I would argue that in private practice you can have the same type of idol from your curriculum vitae, that it might not just be your academic prowess, it might be your social mobility or the things that you attach yourself to, your zip code or your neighborhood or your kid's school, and we can take many good things. I wouldn't say like living in a safe place is a bad thing. Like I feel like I live in a safe place. We tend to make bad things in idols, but we also tend to make good things in idols. One famous guy, dead guy from the 16th century, said our hearts are factory making machines. We produce idols out of our hearts left and right. And I know I do. I make idols of all of these things. And I think in medicine and in dentistry, especially where we are, I would group myself with y'all. I mean, I'm like 5 years advanced to where you are. This quote from Tim Keller like struck me deeply. It's a quote that Tim Keller's a preacher in New York City, and he quotes a friend, an anonymous physician friend, who wrote this about where he is. He said, the temptation is for medicine to take over your life and rule your life as an enslaving power. It's a subtle one because there's a kind of moral ego massage because you are given so much, so many hours, so much responsibility, so much stress to do so much good in other people's lives. There's a lot of self-justifying power in that kind of idolatry. It's much easier to feel morally superior as a doctor than as a stockbroker. There's also in some people the need to be needed and the power buzz you get from having influence. And I think this is a very real struggle that I think we will all continue to face. You may not, but I think it's probably lying dormant in many of you, and you'll see that if you're a third year, fourth year on the wards, or in the clinic, like I finally arrived. I'm like, I felt this way. Like this is what I've worked for forever, and you feel like you're really big stuff, and like you're doing all this great, amazing stuff, and you're writing orders, and half the time you're writing stuff and about to kill somebody, and thankfully there are people watching over you and making sure you're doing the right thing. But there's this great temptation in medicine. Another preacher from the early 20th century was a physician in London, Martin Lloyd-Jones, and he was speaking to medical students, and he said, there's a lot of folks, a lot of good men that I've been to their funerals, and their tombstone read, born a man, died a doctor. And his point was, they made their entire life about their job, and it's very, very tempting. I feel tempted. Like, I went up to work the other day on a day off just to kind of check some email, and had a project that I wanted to check in on because the due date was up. I found myself spending like 30 or 45 minutes like that, not even doing clinical stuff, just kind of doing some research stuff. and it was like dinner time. I'm preparing for this talk, and I've got all this on my mind, and I'm still struggling with it. So I would just bring this to your mind now. If you haven't started struggling with it, you may in the future. And as a reference or as a foil, I would recommend reading the passage from John chapter 3. And it's a rehearsal or a rehash. You know, some folks are coming to John the Baptist saying, hey, aren't you supposed to be a great man? And previously, in like chapter 1 of John, he said, I am not the Christ. I am not the Christ. There's one much greater than I am. Like, we are not the Christ. We're not the ones who are so great and able to save others. So sometimes in medicine and dentistry, you feel like you're doing this great good, but we're not the Christ. We're here so that he might increase and that we might decrease. And that's a challenge to me and a good reminder to me. I actually had that passage. My best friend was ordained as a minister maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and they called him up to the front of the sanctuary when he was being ordained, and the invited ministers, the elderly minister was preaching, and he made him stand in front of the auditorium and repeat that. He said, I am not the Christ. And he made my friend, the pastor, say, I am not the Christ. And he made him do it like 5 or 6 times. Like, just remember that. You are not the Christ. You can't save anybody. And so in your ministry, I would just recommend that to you. We're to decrease so that Christ might increase. Whatever your ministry might be, whether it's nursery at church, whether it's through CMDA, whether it's teaching Sunday school, whatever you're called to, I'll leave that with you. So another helpful thing when you're struggling with finding your identity elsewhere, finding your identity in the idols of culture, would be to refresh your memory of what is the biblical story, what does the Bible say about me? And you probably have read this at some point about creation, fall, and redemption, that Scripture, Genesis 1 and 2, creation is great, it's amazing. We're placed in it, in the garden, and we're supposed to tend and cultivate the garden. And then chapter 3, we mess up, we fall. Chapter 3, verse 15, there's grace and redemption promised that the promised one would come and strike the heel of the serpent. And the rest of the Bible is about God fulfilling that promise of redeeming his people. And that's the story that we're a part of. We were placed in this amazing cosmos, this amazing universe, and God is redeeming it. It fell, and God is now redeeming it. And he's invited us to be part of that. And that's really refreshing to me as a non-preacher, non-pastor. Growing up, I always had this dichotomy of like, you know, if I was really following God, I would be a preacher. And I really struggled with that. That's, I think, why I went to seminary. And I felt that everything else was inferior to that calling. But when we think of ourselves as ambassadors of Christ, putting the bits back together, as one author says, like that makes cleaning a tooth an ordinary process. I couldn't do that. It would be very difficult for me. So not simple, but an ordinary thing that you've probably cleaned 8 million teeth in your experience. That's putting the bits back together. That's participating with Christ in redeeming his world. And that's something that I, as a physician, get to do. And sometimes when I'm thinking like, oh, anesthesia, I don't get this great experience or this long-term follow-up with patients. We kind of have a very brief encounter, but that is a very poignant moment. Half the time I blow it because I don't stop and slow down and realize like this is the person about to entrust me with their life. They don't know how anesthesia works. They just think that they're going to be like this far from death and then they're going to be like back awake again. That's a lot of people, that's all they know. And I have that experience to come in and just help them understand what's going to happen, reassure them, make them less anxious, and then take good care of them. Make sure that, literally, make sure their heart doesn't stop beating and that their lungs, they don't stop breathing. That's refreshing to know. That's kingdom work. I don't have to come up here and talk about the Bible to do kingdom work. And for me, being reminded of that is helpful because I don't always get it right. But thinking about that initially was just so rewarding. And I think it was probably in seminary when I heard some pastors talking about this. I thought, So maybe that's why I really enjoy when I go and visit patients in the hospital and being in that setting. I can see myself in that setting a lot more than I can see myself running a church or preaching. And that's when it kind of clicked for me. So I hope that helps next time you were checking someone's CVC on the wards, or even if you're just studying, that is kingdom work that you're doing. So our purpose, I've already kind of gotten into this. This is something I struggled with. Deciphering, what is our calling? I struggled, like in my journal from high school even, I've looked back at it a couple of times, and there I was like, should I be a lawyer, should I be a doctor, should I be a preacher? And then I kind of had this flow chart of what's the most important studies, like theology is the queen of all the studies for sure. Philosophy is a little bit under that. Maybe math and music are way up there. Those are all things that I really don't know much about. And then there's like biology way down here, and I liked that, I was good at that. So I really struggled in my mind to tease out, like, what is God calling me to do? Because I feel like that's better than all this stuff. And I want to emphasize this. God's calling in your life, whatever you think you're called to do, He's not calling you to something or to somewhere. He's calling you to Himself. He's calling you to someone. And that's your primary calling. And that's so refreshing to me because I feel like I haven't gotten it right. I've changed career fields. I changed colleges before that. I've changed specialties after choosing medicine. I mean, I'm all over the place, but God's constant. And He's saying to me, I'm calling you to myself, trust and obey, and I'm leading you somewhere. And a great book, I'll put a shout out for The Call by Os Guinness. I think that helped me quite a bit. It's a very easy read, lots of history in it, so if you don't like history, forget I said that. If you do like history, there's lots of little, just short, like every chapter starts with a historical review and then it applies it to a concept of a call. And he does a great job of delineating your primary call from your second call. And your secondary call is kind of what we tend to think about when we think about, where's God calling me to? Is He calling me to be a dentist or to be a physician, or is He calling me to be a pediatrician or to be an obstetrician or an anesthesiologist? God's secondary call on your life is unique to you. I can't give you the recipe, and that's where I was always like, oh, preacher, just tell me what to do. Like, give me Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto so I can just mark it off and do the next thing. But when I read this, I was like, no, God's calling me to Himself. It's a relationship that He is going to walk me through, and He's not going to make it easy. That's when our secondary calling, considering who God is as sovereign, is that everyone everywhere and in everything should think, speak, live, and act entirely for Him. We can therefore properly say as a matter of secondary calling that we are called to homemaking. Maybe there's some people here who are called to homemaking. Or to the practice of law, or to art history, I would add, the art of medicine, art of ministry. But these and other things are always the secondary, never the primary calling. They are callings rather than the calling. They are our personal answer to God's address, our response to God's summons. Secondary callings matter, but only because the primary calling matters most. So if you're struggling with where does God have you, just remember that He has you next to Him, seeking His face and counsel. And there's wise counsel. Like, I wouldn't say you're not going to know. Like, God uses means. He hasn't spoken to me in a vision or whispered in my ear and told me, but He's used wise men and women in my life to ask tough questions, to say, hey, you're really good at this, or that, you're not so great at that. Why don't you consider this? So He uses secondary means, and it's not all like crystal clear in the Bible on how should we do this, right? Like, I would love to be able to open the Bible and say, okay, how long should I stay in the military? What fellowship should I think about? Where should I send my kids to school? Like, back in the day, who should I marry? There aren't passages for that. But by light of nature and Christian prudence, like, we can figure a lot of stuff out. If it's not immoral, and we're kind of gifted in it and we enjoy it, perhaps you should try it out, like when you're thinking about your calling. Other than that, God may not be that specific. Maybe he will be very specific. Like you may get into a motor vehicle crash on your way to an interview at some place. Well, that just ruined that opportunity. Well, God's in control of that too. So really the ordinariness of figuring out your calling or figuring out what you should do with your life, I would just say look to some like wise people in your life. They don't have to be Christians. People that know you, people that you interact with. When I initially sat down to look at this, I wanted to include this, and it's kind of like trying to fit Sir William Osler into a presentation. He was a guy who actually brought students into the clinic. So you can either love him or hate him for that. Residents living, like resident, because you live there, like on the 4th floor at Johns Hopkins, on the roof, is because of him. He was one of the founders of Johns Hopkins, and he determined that medical students shouldn't just have a 2-year curriculum and then be sent out to terrorize the public. They should be properly trained. He would teach at the bedside, and he was a prolific writer. He edited the first systematic textbook of medicine. I shouldn't say the first, like Galen wrote the systematic textbook, but the first modern systematic textbook of medicine. And his advice was, you should be imperturbable, and you should have great equanimity. Like, that's his advice to people going into the health professions. You shouldn't be flustered easily around your patients. And I think that's good advice, right? Like, something doesn't go correct. Like, if the dentist working on my teeth is like, oh no, I don't like that. Like, that makes sense to me. That's good advice. If I walk into a situation where it's like anesthesia stat, like that's a bad thing. That means somebody's trying to die in the operating room. You walk into that and you act flustered, you're not going to help. You're going to hurt. So this makes a lot of sense to me. But that's just a little bit, right? That's just some nice advice from a wise man. His son died in World War I, and he was devastated. It broke him. Like, he couldn't give you advice on how to live a good life in the light of grief. Like, he didn't do that well. But he did medicine really well. And I think that we can like look to people like this or people in your life who may or may not be Christians who can give you good advice on specifics. Another example, anybody know who this is? He's our chancellor of UT now. He was the admiral, 4-star admiral, in charge of the Special Operations Command at the end of Iraq and Afghanistan. He gave a speech. I would commend it to you. Commencement speech 2014, University of Texas. Anybody there? Anybody graduate 2014? Yeah? So, okay. You're there, okay. So it's a great speech. He took his experience as a Navy SEAL and training there and applied it to life. He said, make your bed every morning. Do the simple stuff. And that goes with the last thing. I'll wrap it up because we've got like 2 minutes. Do your duty. This is from a lecture to students, to theological students in seminary. This is B.B. Warfield. He's a famous theologian. And he said, first and foremost, you need to study. Like, if you're a Christian and you're in school, God's called you to be a student. You need to do really well studying. Now, you don't neglect your duty as a son, as a husband, as a father, but you need to be the best at studying that you can be, like the old Army saying. That's what you've been called to. Like, it's pretty simple. It's straightforward. This is a time in your life that you're not going to have 40 hours a week, I guarantee you. You're never going to have 80 hours a week to study, ever again in your life. And sometimes you feel like you need it, but you're never going to have it again. And God's called you to study. He's not called you to neglect other things. His second point with that was don't forsake assembling together. Hebrews 10 talks about it. Like, doing this, church on Sunday, those are extremely important for your soul and for your future benefit to society, benefit to the church. So I would highly recommend, like, get involved with your local church. I'll echo what Warfield says. And then finally, just personal devotion. Like, when that year that I was basically not going to church because of my rotation schedule, I wasn't reading the Bible every day. I can't say I was praying for an hour every day. I missed weeks on end, and I felt the drain. And I went to the CMDA lecture and was refreshed and reminded, like, if I'm not there, at least I need to be trying to stoke the fires of the Holy Spirit in my prayer closet. And that's something I continue to struggle with. I'm not going to stand up here and say, now I figured it all out. I pray for an hour and a half every morning, and I read 2 hours because I don't have to study as much anymore. It's going to be something we likely struggle with the rest of our lives. And the last thing I'll leave you with is another quote by Tim Keller on this idea that there are different seasons in your life. The season that we're going through, maybe I'm almost through, talks about Sabbath. And like I talked about earlier, it's possible to voluntarily take on a season of work that requires high energy, long hours, and insufficient weekly Sabbath time. A new physician, new dentist, whatever, has to work long hours in a residency program, for example, and many other careers such as finance, government, law, similarly demand some sort of initial period of heavy, intense work. Starting your own business or pursuing, like a lot of you dentists, probably going to be starting your own business. Dental school isn't going to be the end of it. Starting your own business or pursuing a major project like making a movie will require something similar. In these situations, you have to watch that you don't justify too little Sabbath by saying you're going through just another season, when in actual fact, that season never ends. If you must enter a season like this, it should not last longer than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years at the most. Be accountable to someone for this, or you will get locked into an under-Sabbath lifestyle, and you will burn out. And during this under-Sabbath time, don't let the rhythms of prayer, Bible study, and worship die. Be creative, but get it in. That's what I would leave with you. If that's the only thing you take and you're still like here and you're not running to your next class, please be creative and get it in. That's my advice to you. That's the way God has worked in my life. That's the way He continues to work. It's through the ordinary means of grace. It's not anything spectacular. Your daily life may not be filled with some great experience like going on a great mission trip, which, by the way, Roatan is amazing. I was there in October. So a little plug, like, Roatan is an amazing place, but your life isn't going to be filled with those amazing experiences. It's going to be ordinary daily living, and the local church, Bible study, prayer, fellowship like this is what's going to keep you motivated for the long haul, the long work that we have in front of us. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll take any questions before y'all run off to your next class. I think I'm like 2 minutes over, so I apologize. That's all I have for you.